reported that Israeli troops used anti-tank missiles and helicopter gunships to deter Palestinian protesters. Showing, also mentioned that Palestinians were throwing rocks, people were firing back with guns. And that's the kind of disproportionate attacks and indiscriminate attacks that they talked about. In 2002 and 2008, when we saw them increase more, there were reports, for example, that Israelis were firing shells rather than at nighttime when buildings were empty, in midday when schools were filled. There are massive reports about how shells were destroying UN schools, the death toll of children at that time within the Palestinian territories. In 2000, we saw the biggest increase for Palestinians, and this had to do with the obvious fact that they declared an intifada or rebellion, and were the aggressor in this case. Each time it went down was due to the fact that the Palestinian attacks were in effect disabling Palestinian terrorists, but they were also attacking Palestinian civilians as well, which leads us to our victim frame. Now for the victim frame, I utilize certain standards as well. Anytime Israelis or Palestinians are portrayed as a terrorism victim, oppressed people, displaced citizens, or as a retaliator over aggressor, they are framed as a victim. So retaliator frame is important to understand because it means that anytime the media frame them as fighting back or fighting terrorism, rather than just simply aggressing on another side, they are often framed more so as a victim. And the results, again, were very interesting. Simply on the Israeli side, what we saw was that roughly between 1993, 2000, and 2008, Israelis were framed about 21% of the time as victims. And then we saw a big spike in 2002. Now the reason for this was because that we saw the Bush administration, the Israeli government, and Israeli citizens all appeal to a specific frame, a specific zeitgeist of the time, which is terrorism. So what we saw here was a spike in the use of the word terrorism, describing Palestinian attacks as terrorist activity. If you notice in 2002, in the villain frame, they were also framed very highly as a victim, being framed as both villain and victim during this frame. The reason had to do with the fact that while many journalists justified the attacks based upon responding to terrorist activity, the attacks that they were doing were so unproportional that the indiscriminate attacks were so violent that often it overshadowed the fact that they were also being victims as well. And again, over the time we saw Palestinians increase. As Palestinian victims increased, I mean, we saw, of course, that Israeli villainous frame increased as well. The reason for the Palestinians being increased, the increased frame of Israelis being framed as victims, had to do with the fact that reporters started reporting directly from the Palestinian territories. Often, especially in 1993, we saw many sources being from US or Israeli press releases, and US press releases. Eventually we saw reporters reporting directly from Palestine, giving first-hand accounts of what was going on, the bloodshed, the attacks, basically the repercussions of the policies that Israel was telling the United States that it was doing. It also saw it saw journalists interviewing Palestinian citizens and trying to get a better understanding of why Palestinians felt this way and why they felt they were needed to attack Israel. One interview epitomized the displaced citizen frame when they interviewed an 80-year-old Palestinian man who said that he was made a refugee in 1948 when Israel was made a refugee again in 1967 during Israel's Six-Day War, and asking the media and in fact the United States people, where do I go now? Showing the kind of paradox that the Palestinian people are in at that time. Now the pursuer of peace frame was a pretty straightforward frame. Anytime they're seen as pursuing peace, they're framed as such. As a result, what happened was that this frame tended to reflect the historical context of what was going on at the time. 1993 showed the highest frame for pursuer of peace for obvious reasons that they were pursuing the Oslo Accords. And in 2002, we saw the near extinction of the pursuer of peace frame. This had to do for two reasons. During 2002, there was a prime minister named Ariel Sharon who was in power at the time. He was often attributed to the word hawkish, in being described by the media, often seen more so as a troublemaker than someone seen to try to prevent problems. For example, the first articles by the Houston Chronicle, Washington Post, and the New York Times all quoted Ariel Sharon as saying that he wished he killed then chairman of the Palestinian Authority, Yasser Arafat, when he had the chance. So in that he didn't really want to sit down at a table with Yasser Arafat to negotiate peace. Also, the reason why we saw the severe drop in the Palestinian peace frame was due to the fact that during the incursion, Israeli forces were consistently launching artillery attacks onto the Palestinian Authority's offices, leaving Yasser Arafat pretty much holed up in his offices, unable for the media to reach him. And we did see a decrease in Palestinian officials being quoted and more Palestinian citizens being quoted at that time. In 2008, we saw again a revival of the pursuit of peace frame by a little bit. This had to do with the fact that in 2006, Ariel Sharon suffered a massive stroke and has since been in a vegetative state. This gave the way for Prime Minister Ehud Omer to take over at that time and was seen more as a centrist and more willing to pursue peace. On the Palestinian side, there was an increase, but not as much, due to the fact that Hamas took over in the Gaza Strip and which the media never failed to remind readers was declared a terrorist organization by the United States. The incompetent frame, I utilized two standards. So every time the Israeli government or Palestinian government were seen as having a failed leadership or a corrupt government, it often was framed as being incompetent. And what we saw exactly was that this frame tended to focus more on the individual leaders at the time. 1993 had the highest discrepancy between Israelis and Palestinians, having to do with the fact that Yasser Arafat needed to be involved in the peace negotiations. Often the media would point to the fact that Palestinians would be negotiating but couldn't really do anything without Yasser Arafat there, framing the entire organization without Yasser Arafat as incompetent as far as pursuing peace goes. 2002, we saw another big disparity happen. This had to do with the fact that Yasser Arafat eventually died 2 years later, but coming up to that time in 2002, he was being framed as an ailing leader, unable to control his people. One article said that Yasser Arafat could never secure peace, and even if he did, he wouldn't be able to enforce it anyway. And then we saw a severe drop by the Palestinians in 2008, severe drop. This had to do again with the fact that the media tended to focus on Hamas, who took over Gaza. And while the media never failed to remind us that they were a terrorist organization, they never frame them as incompetent, actually pointing to the mass social programs that Hamas is doing, as well as their ability to try to reduce the amount of rocket fire being launched into Israel. On the Israeli side, much of this had to do with, much of the incompetent frame was attributed, first of all, to the fact of bringing into question whether or not mass retaliation actually had an effect on deterring radical Palestinian terror. Also to the fact of, in 1993, 2000, 2002, much of the incompetent frame had to do with the fact of a fragmented Israeli government. In 1995, between these two critical junctures and when the increase happened, Yitzhak Rabin, who was the prime minister in 1993, was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli citizen who did not agree with the prospects of peace. As a result, we saw much dialogue, especially in 2000, regarding kind of trying to reconcile both the right and the centrist government into kind of creating a peace agreement. Now, as far as indexing goes, what we saw was that indexing remained relatively equal for the most part. In 2000, we saw an increase by pro-Israeli sources due to the fact that the 2000 presidential election was happening at that time. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict was a semi-big issue, and so the Bush administration especially was being quoted a lot, obviously in support of Israel. In 2008 and 2002, we saw an increase in Palestinian sourcing, especially in 2008 and 2009. This again had to do with the fact that reporters reporting directly from Gaza, giving first-hand interviews with Palestinian citizens, etc. As far as inclusion goes, what I saw was that there was no effect of a Democratic-Republican administration. I expected to see that it would actually be media would shift, kind of be a lapdog to whatever administration was happening, and in a sense be more favorable to Israel during the Republican administration. In fact, what happened was the opposite happened. And the reason for this in large part had to do with responsible journalism. John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt said that coverage of the media tended to be in favor of Israel because they were pro-Israeli themselves. What this showed, though, in fact, my study shows that professional norms trumps opinions of the journalists, meaning that personal sentiments do not affect their professional reporting ability, which actually for us is an extremely promising prospect, especially when we want, not to quote Fox News, but fair and balanced news. And so again, what we saw was informed journalists. We didn't see journalists taking Israeli press releases, US press releases, or even Palestinian statements for granted. You saw them actually going in there, investigating what the claims were and seeing whether or not they were truthful. So ultimately, the main conclusion is that times have in fact changed since Senator Borzig was senator in 1976. And in fact, the US can rest assured, hopefully by this study, that the United States is actually portraying the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a much more accurate and fair way for us to digest. Questions?